and we don't want to miss the genius of all the speakers here. So we'll be starting now. The session 3, as it's titled Aesthetics, will be chaired by Professor Zeynep Direk from Koç University. She's the chair of this session, and we have 3 wonderful speakers who have produced and contributed very profound work on Dalit literature. The first is Professor Raj Kumar from Delhi University. There is our own very own research scholar who's now graduated with a PhD, Aarushi Punia. There is Professor Sowjanya from Woxsen University. I request the speaker, the chair, to please come and introduce the speakers and start the session. Thank you.
Okay, shall I come there, or can I do it from here? Okay, I'm very happy to play this role in this session on aesthetics. Our first speaker is Raj Kumar, and the title of his talk is Ethics of Dali Aesthetics. I'm very sorry, I'm shortening the introduction because we are running out of our time. Raj Kumar is professor of English at Delhi University. He specializes in Dali literature, autobiographical studies, Indian literature, post-colonial studies. Shall I introduce the second and the third speaker right away? Okay, our second speaker is Aarushi Punia. The title of her talk is Literary Misrepresentations of Dali Women in Upper Caste Writings. Dr. Aarushi Punia was awarded a PhD in 2024 from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, for her thesis titled Pathopoiesis, the Narration of Sufferings and Existence in Dali and Palestinian Literature. And our last speaker is Sowjanya Tamalapakula from Woxsen University. The title of her talk is Performance as Labor, Gender, Religion, and Sexuality. Sowjanya Tamalapakula is an associate professor at Woxsen University, specializing in gender studies, cinema, and media. And she published extensively in national and international journals on gender, sexuality, caste, queerness, media, and sociology of religion. So I am giving the platform to our first speaker.
Yeah, good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Dibya, the organizer, for the invitation, and her team, of course. This is a very important deliberation, I must tell you, architectures of inequality. And as we have already heard, I heard at least 2-3 speakers, social scientists talking about how, and particularly, Professor Narendra asking the question, how caste has come into the domain of academic discussion very late, as if it was not there, whereas caste is there for millennia, not just century, but millennium. I just wanted to make few observations before I start my paper. The title of my paper is Ethics of Dalit Aesthetic, and I'll argue there that how coming up Dalit writing is most significant event in the history of India, because earlier Dalit were not supposed to speak out in the public. They were considered to be lesser than animals and birds of the street, as Professor Jogdown was referring to Gopal Guru's term, walking carrion. So they were muted and silent, and they were not silent. They were made silent by the so-called, Hindu religious scriptures, enforced religiously quite systematically. So with the coming of, I'm sorry, that I have to, give you some, that instances of how Dalit literature came into being, but I'm sure, that many of you know about. So what I want to tell you is that unlike social sciences where, see, Ambedkar, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, that is to be considered, that maybe if you talk about sociology, he should be called the father of Indian sociology, so also economics, history, political science, law, psychology, but we don't talk, no? We don't talk because most of the Indian academic institutions are being governed, shall I say, ruled by the, that upper caste and class. And that's why the idea of architectures of inequality is very important to understand about and also to evaluate, and that is what we are doing today. My domain is literature, and that's why maybe I'll come straight forward to the idea of how till very recently, I always ask this question, and I'm very happy that many of my students are there from Delhi University, where Dalit study is now a compulsory paper for postgraduate, and 40% undergraduate syllabus is, that content of Dalit literature. So, that they know more or less. I'm sure, that others also know. But then what I want to tell you is that I always ask one question, simple question. When did you read the first Dalit portrayal in Indian literature? Like Indian society was silent for many millennia, Indian literature, like Indian society, culture, was also silent, not writing, not talking, not speaking, particularly in the public sphere, what we call. Now that, there is some, maybe, that consideration of Dalits speaking out, and they are also speaking truth to power. That is what I always talk about. If at all Dalits are speaking, they are speaking truth to power. This idea of truth to power has to be understood in a very critical way. So, my paper will address, that the coming of what is called new Dalit aesthetic and how it not only, that interrogates the whole idea of Indian aesthetic, the so-called mainstream Indian aesthetic, because Indian aesthetic heavily actually loaded with a term like rasa and also dhvani and aloka. I'm sure that many of you, those who have read Indian literature and on Indian literary criticism, will come to realize that if at all you have to read a work of literature, then you have to be a rasika, lover of art. Otherwise, you will not be able to appreciate. I refer to this idea of rasika, the lover of art, because Indian poetics, beginning from Bharata Muni, and I can give you, that any number of names. For example, that Abhinava Gupta, and then there are many others, Abhinava Gupta, Kuntaka, Anandavardhana, along with Bharata. No, these are theorization of Indian poetics. And there is a large chunk of writing whereby they talk about how literature to be read. And when they talk about literature to be read, for example, that I just give one instance where rasa, for example, the idea of rasa, emotion, which can be, that translated into English, and there are 9 kinds of emotion, hope you know, I don't want to bore you. But none of these rasas can be maybe, that used to understand Dalit subjectivity. Let me let me tell you very clearly. So, that how do we go about it? If suppose, that rasa or dhvani theories are to be read along with Indian poetics, and Indian poetics is a kind of literary criticism that is coming in a big way to understand about Indian literature. So, the idea of aesthetic doesn't help us particularly, and that's why there are at least 2 good books by Dalit writers. There are at least theorization of Dalit aesthetic. One is by Sharan Kumar Limbale, another is Om Prakash Balmiki, and there are couple of critical articles, one by Gopal Guru. Gopal Guru has a very interesting article where he talks about how a shoemaker makes a cricket ball, but when Indian upper caste they play with cricket ball, do they think about it aesthetic? Or the ball is just simple a ball, cricket ball. Who makes cricket ball? In other words, you know that in order to understand about Indian caste society and literature, we have to also understand about the literary values which are inscribed in not just text, but also life of people. And that's why, you know, that maybe Aarushi will take a, that clue of it maybe because she is going to present about how Indian upper caste writers, they portrayed Dalit life in, the beginning from maybe, that 1920s onwards. We find there are a couple of Indian writers who start writing about Dalit life. Say, that the first one is Malapalli by Unnava Lakshmi Narayan, 1921 to begin with. Before that, I don't think, that there is any major chunk of writing on Dalit life. And then we have Premchand 1925, then Sivasankar, Sivasankar Pillai, of course, Gopinath Mohanty, and many others, that. So beginning from 1920s. But what happened before, I have already asked the question that as if Dalit, they didn't exist before. So now Dalit writings, if at all we have to understand about, is not only a what is called counter culture. There is a word counter culture whereby, the Dalit are also trying to assert, that themselves by saying that we here exist. And please, that don't ignore it. But how do they write about? That is the question. And so far as Dalit writings are concerned, of course, we know that there are lots of theorization. Dalit study is not old. Now it is 70 years old. If suppose we go by modern Dalit literature, 1972, precisely, Dalit Panthers movement. And so, that whereby we understand now through Dalit writing, what about freedom, dignity, equality, self-respect, these are, and then justice, social, economic, and political, which was, that enshrined in Indian Constitution, if you read preamble. And that's why Dalit writers, they always accuse Indian literature as Hindu literature, because there is always a kind of stamp on, that Hindu values, Hindu system, Hindu idea of, that thing. And we heard 3 psychologists talking about, that how caste and Varna in many ways exist in, that not just academic discourse, but also in the real life of the people. So someone working on Brahmin, say Tamil Brahmin. Now, Dalit aesthetic are to be understood in, there are 2 ways. One, that what Dalit writers are theorizing, they talk about, that Rasa and Dhyani theory may not be able to do justice to the idea of reading Dalit literature. And that's why there is Toral Jatin Gajarwala, who is also theorizing in a big way in her book Untouchable Fiction, where she talks about Dalit writing is nothing but rehabilitation of what went wrong in the past. In other words, the existing literary criticism may not be helpful to understand Dalit life and Dalit writings. Because life and writing are to be clubbed together if you understand about Dalit writing. And one has to be very sensible and sensitive. If suppose you are reading a Dalit literary text, it is not just merely a product of, that writing, there is also lived life experiences. And that's why we say that almost all Dalit writings are autobiographical, whether it is poetry, fiction, or anything, that. Now, so, that this idea of Dalit aesthetic has to be understood in 2 terms, as I said. One, as Sharan Kumar Limbale theorizes, and I'll read maybe one or two lines, that Dalit writers believe that their literature should be analyzed from a sociological perspective, focus on social values, then on beauty. This is, that whereby we have to highlight. And that's why an inclusive aesthetic theory may not be able to help us to understand about Dalit text. This is where, that one, that argument is. The other argument is by Prakash Balmiki, whose Dalit Saundarya Shastra, which is recently being translated into English, and he writes that it is a life affirmative action, life-giving action. Literature is not just merely a text, just to be read and forgotten, but it must be also, understood that art for life's sake. There was a big debate, art for art, meaning art for art's sake and art for life's sake. And that's why literature has to be understood in a very serious way. And that's why the title of my paper is The Ethics of Dalit Aesthetic, because we as readers, we as audience here in this seminar room, we as maybe general reader, whether researcher or general reader, do we have certain responsibilities after reading a text, after that having a discourse? Maybe that I always think that in a seminar like this we are revolutionary. No, all of us. But when we go back home, whether the values that we talk about, do we try to ascribe it or try to implement in our day-to-day life? That's where the ethics is coming. So, Prakash Balmiki actually talks about how Dalit writing has to be understood in a very serious way, because it is not art for art's sake, but it is art for life's sake. And that's why Dalit writers are also asking for writing revolution. And revolution definitely, of course, we understand. And I should try to take you back to 1930s, maybe something happened in India where progressive writers like Premchand and many others, they came to a platform where Premchand inaugurated, that first progressive writers conference, reading a paper titled Sahitya Ka Uddesh, the aim of literature. And then, that he definitely pointed out that the aim of literature is to bring social change. But then we also understand about even Premchand and many other progressive writers. You talk about any progressive writer, I can give you 10 or 12 names. Beginning from maybe, that Mulkraj Anand to Premchand to Mahasweta Devi to Ananta Murthy to, that any number of progressive writers you can think about, there are contradictions in their writings. Because I always see, that some sort of romanticization about Dalit lives. I use the word romanticization. There is no, that there is not enough time to discuss about, say, Mulkraj Anand's great novel, 1935, called Untouchable. Does he give any agency to Baka? This is the question that you have to think about. Or Premchand's, that idea of Rangbhumi, 1925, where there is double marginalization. No? Surdas, who is a Dalit but also visually challenged. And his idealism has to be questioned. The way Premchand brings an end to the novel, Surdas has to die. This is in contrast to what Dalit writers write about. Dalit writers, they question the whole idea of idealism, because Dalit writings is all about, that the realism, the daily life they have to struggle hard. And that's why, again, Toral Jatin Gajarwala talks about, if Premchand and many progressive writers, they wrote about what is called social realism, Dalit writings are to be understood as neo-social realism, one step forward. Now, the idea of, that reviewing Dalit writings, of course, that look at Namdev Dhasal's writing. we may not be able to understand the way his language, for example, that for the first time, a language which is very simple, ordinary, coarse, raw, from the slum coming into the purview of Indian literature. That is very important. Also, that look at Bama's writing. Her writing is not, the textbook Tamil language. It is very, that ordinary language, mundane language of the street. So, along with, that the lived experiences, what Dalit writers are also writing about is to use a language which is their own. It may be, it may hear coarse and kind of, that unpalatable. And that's why, that my, I don't know, someone has to remind me about time, that, yeah? Over? So can I conclude now? Because, that I have a conclusion. Give me a minute, whereby, that what I want to tell you about the ethics of, say, Dalit aesthetic when we talk about is one way to understand about, that ethics of Dalit aesthetic is whether the lived life experiences of everyday Dalit life to be, that understood properly by reading a Dalit text, that is one. Interpret it, becoming sensible and sensitive as a reader or maybe a student of literature. And that think about a very different kind of literary criticism. Literary criticism is, that very important, whereby literature has to be understood as a, that as an agent of social change. No, these are some of the things. I actually, that I have a full paper where I quote toward the end Arindam Chakrabarti, who talks about a new ethically responsible aesthetic. There is no time to read it. How Dalit aesthetic has to be understood as a new ethically responsible aesthetic. So thank you so much for your patient listening.
Yes, now Aarushi.
Okay, now it's on. Yeah, all right, yeah. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today for the second CPCR conference. This conference is, of course, very, very close to our heart. We've seen it from its inception, from a special issue, to the first conference that happened last year, and I'm so happy to see its continuation. This panel is, of course, extremely special to me. Professor Raj Kumar was my professor at Delhi University. The only professor who taught Dalit literature there, the only person who's defended Dalit studies vehemently, and is responsible for Dalit literature being there in the Delhi University curriculum. Sowjanya's research is perhaps something that I refer to in all of my own research, and she's really leading the way for understanding Dalit feminism. So my presentation sort of continues from where Professor Raj Kumar left it. And the focus is, of course, for this panel on Dalit narratives and aesthetics. And my presentation is titled The Narrative Suppression of Dalit Women's Consciousness in Upper Caste Writings. So today's presentation proposes a new method of reading Indian literature informed by the history and politics of Dalits, a self-appropriated term by untouchables in India, which means oppressed or broken. It offers a critique of the regime of representation set in place by anti-caste literature written by non-Dalits, and reflects on the role that these narratives have played in forming the literary stereotype of the silent, servile, self-effacing Dalit. Given the historical and socio-political suppression of Dalit aspirations, Dalit literature and testimonies have two distinct aims: the non-Brahmanical representation of Dalits and the articulation of lower caste experiences of caste-based discrimination. For instance, Bama calls Dalit literature a part of cultural politics and a form of protest. So this paper is a part of a project that began with the evaluation of upper caste writing that represents lower caste lives. Some of these, as rightly mentioned by Professor Raj Kumar, are Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable, Raja Rao's Kanthapura, Rabindranath Tagore's Chandalika, Premchand's Kafan, U.R. Ananthamurthi's Samskara, Mahashweta Devi's Rudali, and Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things. Anti-caste literature written by non-Dalits should ideally be considered a supplement to Dalit literature in its aim to achieve Dalit emancipation. However, a Dalit reading, and I'd like you to think of that in lines of a feminist reading or against the grain reading style, a Dalit reading of anti-caste literature written by non-Dalits reveals that while these narratives may document the violence and inequality experienced by Dalits, they often use Dalits as props to provoke upper caste pity and sympathy. The problem is that the upper caste writer is celebrated for being intellectually awakened, for representing Dalits, even if such representation borders on tokenism, while historically Dalits who have been raising their voices against injustice are ignored. In a paper that will now be published by the Journal of Narrative Theory this year, I conduct a Dalit reading of U.R. Ananthamurthi's Samskara and Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things. I define Dalit reading as an interpretive act that puts the Dalit character in the center with an imagined Dalit-generated consciousness rather than ventriloquizing the voice of the Brahmin. A Dalit reading provides an intervention in pedagogical, academic, and reading practices that have been dominated by upper castes, since it introduces a consciousness of the political history of the mobilization of Dalits into the reading of anti-caste literature. And therefore, I demonstrate how Samskara and God of Small Things do not merely omit focalization by lower caste characters, rather they suppress focalization by them. Focalization, as theorized by Gerard Zeynep, answers the question of who sees as opposed to who speaks. It presents the consciousnness, subjectivity, and feelings of the characters, not necessarily through words or direct speech. Zeynep identifies three kinds of focalization: zero focalization, where the knowledge of the narrator is equal to that of the character; external focalization, where the character is focalized through the narrator who knows more about the story world than the character; and internal focalization, where the knowledge of the character is more than that of the narrator, and his or her thoughts and actions are focalized through the self that sees and speaks. Meekbal explains focalization as the representation of all forms of perception of narrative content, regardless of who does the narrating. When present, a character's focalization facilitates empathy. When absent, it precludes such emotional involvement. In today's presentation, I will focus on the suppressed focalization of the character Chandi, a Dalit woman from the Dom community, in Mahashweta Devi's short story Bayan, which loosely translates as witch. Mahashweta Devi is often described as a writer and a social activist. She was a recipient of the Jnanpith Award, the Ramon Magsaysay Award for her work with the Adivasi and nomadic communities, and she received the civilian honors of Padma Shri and Padma Vibhushan as well. Her work has often been praised and commented upon by upper caste post-colonial feminists and found a place in syllabi across English studies and post-colonial studies departments in India, US, and the UK. For instance, Spivak praises Devi's, and I quote, extraordinary command of North Indian Dalit heteroglossia, unquote, and describes her prose as, and I quote again, a collage of literary Bengali, bureaucratic Bengali, tribal Bengali, and a language of the tribals, unquote, making her one of the most important writers writing in India today. That's in continuation of her quote. In the translator's forward, Spivak says, and I quote again, Mahashweta has followed the Bengali practice of calling each so-called untouchable caste by their name. I have been unable to reproduce this in my translation, end quote. Translated in 1997, following the two waves of Dalit political writings and autobiographies, one must read the absence of the term Dalit in Spivak's work, particularly her translator's introduction, not as an omission but a suppression of the lower caste history of self-determination. The historian Chinnaya Jangam asserts that the category of subaltern does not include dynamics of caste domination and oppression. It also fails to represent experiences of historically marginalized subjects like Dalits. The Dom communities represented in the short story Bayan is traditionally associated with work with the corpses and continues to face aggressive caste discrimination from upper caste people and government officials. In 2020, the rehabilitation of 5 Dom families threatened by the flooding of the Hooghly River was opposed by upper caste residents of an area where the resettlement was proposed. In 2021, during the COVID pandemic, the West Bengal government released a recruitment notice for DOMs for the disposal of dead bodies. There seems to have been a transference in the caste names and job titles, as there now exist advertisable roles by the title of DOMs and junior DOMs. According to research by Dalberg Advisors in 2017, 90% of India's sanitation and morgue workers are actually Dalit. The Dom community was also represented in Neeraj Ghewan's film Masan. So, Ma Shweta Devi's short story begins by describing the moment Chandi was, and I quote, declared a Bayan, a witch, and thrown out of the village. Chandi was turned into a pariah, end quote. The story world is set in what seems to be a village cohabited by the Dom community, but Chandi is a pariah amongst pariahs, who has to live alone and warn people of her approach when she moves. She is described in the words of her son, Bhagirath, as, and I quote, a red-clad figure with a sun-bronzed face framed by wild matted hair, end quote. As a Bayan, he cannot look at her directly and therefore views her image in a pond. He realizes that she is crying while looking at him because she lives separately from him, and the narrative states, and I quote again, in the waters of the pond, her eyes appeared to swim with tears, end quote. Her physical attributes are narrated with definition, but her emotions are distorted with narrative uncertainty. After witnessing a conversation between Chandi and his father Malinder, Bhagirath is told, and I quote again, she may be a Bayan now, but she used to be your mother once, implying that she does not occupy the social role of his mother or even the name Chandi anymore. Bhagirath wonders, is a Bayan human being then? Revealing that to the village, Chandi had become superfluous, which is the fate of the people who live and experience extreme racial discrimination in ethno-national states or states which privilege a fictive identity rooted in ethnicity. The narrative then states, they were not ordinary DOMs, they worked in cremation grounds. Bhagirath learns of the socio-political context of caste in India through a magazine at school. The reader is told, and I quote, Bhagirath had come to know that after the Untouchability Act of 1955, there were no longer any untouchables in India. He also learned that there was something called the Constitution of India, which says that all are equal, end quote. By focalizing a young Dalit child, the narrative weaponizes Devi's heteroglossia to offer a child's innocent and perhaps inaccurate interpretation that untouchables cease to exist, as opposed to untouchability, which was abolished. The suppression of the instrumental role of Ambedkar in drafting the constitution is represented as a childish omission, a fact lost in narration and translation. I'd like to argue that the omission of Ambedkar and the mischaracterization around untouchables or untouchability is actually narrative suppression. For Bhagirath acknowledges that, and I quote, Bhagirath and his kind knew that their co-students as well as the teachers liked them to sit a bit apart, though none but the very poor and the needy from the lower caste came to school, end quote. The narrative implies that the Dom children were treated as inferior even among the lower castes, and I want the audience to pay attention to and remember the phrase, his kind. For the narrative implication is that the Dom community knew that they were different and that the narrative is describing a fact. And therefore, this is not an instance of focalization, but of suppressed focalization. This has often been a narrative strategy in upper caste literature and even political writing representing lower caste lives. The oppressor vanishes from the plot and the fight is staged between lower castes. Chandi is initially described as brave and fearless while working in the graveyard. And I quote, "The word fear was foreign to Chandi. The dead had to be buried. That was her job. What was fearsome or heartless about it?" End quote. These thoughts appear to be focalized by Chandi, but reflect on the acceptance of caste-based occupations that the upper caste enforce upon Dalits. For instance, consider in how the ideal Bhangi, Gandhi asks Dalits to embrace their caste duty and take pride in it. Chandi's apparent courage is tested the day she is physically harassed. She comes back home and she says, "They stoned me." But the narrative is unclear on who constitutes the they. Is it upper caste people living in the village, other lower caste people, or members of the dorm community? Her inability to cremate children after having had a child of her own and her pleas to quit her job are left unheard, for no one in the village seemed to listen. When Chandi's sister-in-law and her daughter dies of smallpox, the narrative states everyone, including the girl's parents, blamed the death on Chandi because of her work in the graveyard. As Chandi resists the accusation, the narrative reports, and I quote, "She pleaded with the dorms," end quote, implying that the collective pronouns of everyone and they refer to the dorm community. There is a shift in the register now from his kind, from Bhagirath and his kind, to they, everyone, and those people. The village, represented by the dorm community, condemns Chandi as a Bayan and forces her to live in isolation. Bhagirath distinguishes himself from the village when he seeks his mother and says, "I have heard you crying." He can verify what even the narrative shied away from and testifies to her suffering. The moment of reconciliation between the mother and the son discarding the fear towards his mother and encouraging her to not see herself as a Bayan, is interrupted by the narrative which says, and I quote, "On her part, the Bayan sat in silence, thinking she knew not what," end quote. The narrative has thus far focalized the thoughts of all characters, but imposes an inarticulacy on Chandi, almost confessing that her thoughts were impenetrable. Her moment of recognition, and I quote, "I am only a shadow of myself," at how discrimination has snatched her life away, is followed by, and I quote again, "She muttered incoherently." This is similar to Samskara, when Chandri's words are described as she mumbled something, when she is speaking to the Brahmins of the village and to God of small things, when Veluta finds himself betrayed by the Syrian Christian family and the Marxist party he served, where, and I quote again, he could hear himself slipping into incoherence. Chandi's fate in the narrative is similar to Veluta and Chandri's. In continuation of the trope where Dalit characters are sacrificed to evoke sympathy from upper caste readers, Chandi actually is made to sacrifice herself in front of a train which was going to be looted by people from the village. So there are two ways of suppressing focalization. The first is eliminating Dalit subjectivity altogether, or by making a Dalit character repeat thoughts that betray an upper caste ideology. By suppressing the focalization of Chandi, the narrative creates and upholds an upper caste world and ethos despite attempting to critique it. As critical readers, our task is to assess narrative strategies developed in upper caste writing that seem to portray Dalit lives while suppressing their history and consciousness. Hence, I propose the adoption of caste, and particularly lower caste and Dalit subjectivity, as a lens through which non-Dalit narratives should be read. Thank you.
Oh, so I'm not operating it from here? No, I have a PPT, so I... Okay. No, can I operate from here? No? Okay, so it's fixed there. So how am I supposed to? Okay. Yeah, that's easy. Yeah, yeah. That's okay. Yeah. So thank you all. This is the second time I'm presenting at CPCR. So my research, I would like to contextualize and leave it over there. But also,
I kind of started this with the question of how caste operates among various mediators, not just Brahmins, but also various other caste groups. So that's how I started this, and this is the second time I'm presenting here. So yeah, that's just title. So yeah, so I actually want to start this this presentation with an analogy. So recently I saw at a coffee place a white man and an Indian man. So both of them were conversing, and this man who's supposedly Indian, that's what I understood. So he was telling the white man, I don't know where this white man is from. So people who talk about caste in India are the people living in the past. And this white man was promptly saying, yes, I quite understood that. After speaking to people in India, I understood that there is no caste, and people are only referring to something which used to be there. So this is like, that's how the caste is. It's like the ghost in the Gothic horror films. It only appears before certain characters, mostly women and children. And the rational white man and the Brahmin man or the upper caste man won't see it till the climax of the film, okay? So it is that ghost which is today coming to, it's almost apparent today in almost all presentations. So I am actually trying to look at how caste operates in certain spaces where even those who are troubled by caste and whose labor is configured by caste within the system of caste also won't be able to see caste. So that is where I am trying to intervene. And so few Dalits, I mean among the academicians, have so far largely looked at caste as also experience, but this is a field-based study. So I'm going to look at the similar traditions that I spoke in the last CPCR, and how the sexuality and the performance is configured within the ritualistic traditions of certain village systems. Okay, so so caste, that invisibility of caste requires a very close study and able to see very invisible depths of the caste, as caste is a very important, significant part of the cultural fabric which weaves into socio-political life, religious life, and also public space, not just in villages but also in urban spaces. So to introduce my work, that women in certain traditions, so some may think, am I talking about Devdasi? Yes and no, I would say as an answer, because see, Devdasi, the way it is understood today is largely what the historians have been speaking on. So the Devdasi of Madras has been abolished in the 1940s. So 1940s set a context, interestingly, with the introduction of the colonial morality and introduction of the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Saxon law, and this has set, this has kind of triggered a lot of anxieties among the nationalists, among those who were envisaging the idea of India. So therefore, these anxieties dealt in different ways. Okay, so Madras Devdasi, the women who were dedicated to the temple as temple dancers, also temple worshippers, where there was also evidently the sexual exploitation by various upper caste and Brahmin men, was abolished on war footing base, because the anxiety also can be called as like the reformists, as Janaki Nair calls the nationalist revivals, wanted to end the practice in some form to see that Indians have a moral ground to self-rule. So the Madras Devdasi was ended largely by the Brahmin men. So much so that very responsible Brahmins of that time have taken Devdasis in order to abolish the form as second, third, fourth wives, that the most responsible people have taken even 5 wives after the caste endogamous wife that he has. So I am not looking at this practice, this is the history, but also what happened was these anxieties led to also lower caste and say the social movements also have gone through the same anxieties. So social movements in a way for a different reasons have gone through this anxiety because there was a construction of wife and non-wife category. And this category is going to evidently stigmatize Dalits further. So therefore, Dalits also have dealt with the Devdasi or the similar practices in the same abolitionist mode. The reasons may be different, but the way it was dealt was similar. But after the Devdasi abolition, so Devdasi is one term and one practice, largely abolished, but there are many more similar local forms. So there are Muralis, there are Joginis, there are Jogammas, Jogapas, Shiv Shaktis. So various other traditions of temple dedication continue to exist. So, yeah, next, oh sorry. So these traditions, I'm also looking at how these traditions have undergone a lot of transformations and what is the shape of these traditions in today's context. So women who perform the sacred arts, for instance, is this really a sacred art? Like what configures a sacred art is also a debatable topic because the dance art form like Kuchipudi was the invention of Devdasis, but when the Devdasi was abolished, but the dance was relegated to the upper caste, particularly elite Brahmins, and Kalakshetra was established in Chennai, like today's Chennai, Madras, where the Brahmins start, performing this erotic art form called Kuchipudi or Bharatanatyam, which became the classical dance art form because it is performed by Brahmins. Okay, so here, women who dance also, like how this labor is extracted, like, often it is a labor, but it's also interestingly not really totally labor because it has its own various different connotations. One of the connotations is its art. And these women not only dance for the male audience, but also they have to be in that particular traditional identity, and this identity is nothing but being married to the god or goddess and not really have the right to marry any mortal man. So they have to stay inside that tradition because of parampara. Okay, so women from the communities of Dhangar community in Maharashtra and Matang, and there are also other castes. So often when you ask these women or even the men or upper castes in the village, like, is it a caste-based practice? No, it is not a caste-based practice because it's not one caste that is there. There are many Dalit castes, many tribal communities that are there in the caste. So the idea of what is caste-based also have to be navigated very interestingly. So because Angel was really reflecting a lot on the field notes, field experiences, I would like to also ask, I would like to also put it when I ask them, is it caste-based? No. How many castes are there? There are some 10 or like 11 number of castes which are there in this practice as parampara because their community, their family has the parampara. So when their family has the parampara, it is not caste-based. You have to ask, are there Brahmin Murlis? No. Okay, are there any Reddiyar Murlis? No. So Kunbi, some very poor people were there, but Kunbi is largely also not there. And also, it also gives rise to another concept of wife and non-wife category within the Dalits also. Not all Dalit women are dedicated to the temples as Joginis or Murlis. Not all, and many of them are also married in the middle class, upper caste way of marrying a mortal man. So paradoxically, there are two ways. Maybe the term paradoxically is very loosely used at this point because on the one hand, they have to extract this labor of performance, but on the other hand, also, they stigmatize them. Why, despite stigma, how does this stigma operates in two ways? One is because there is a stigma. Women will not be appropriated into usual whatever, like quote unquote marriage, because the stigma continues. And this same stigma also helps the upper caste to distinguish between the sexual purity of their women and the women who belong to the lower caste groups. So that stigma has a very interesting role. Like the stigma is something which women are very much aware of, and they keep discussing about it, but at the same time, they also do not find it easy to get out of that stigma, because no one really wants to live with the stigma, social stigma, particularly being women who are immoral, who are also lower caste, and Dalits. So here, the one of the contradictions I would like to also navigate is, on the one hand, Gopal Guru talks about, conceptualizes Dalit body as walking carrion, and on the other hand, also there is this desirability to watch these women dancing. Okay, so Nazar and Nazariya are two important aspects of their life. That Nazariya is nothing but the perspectives of good woman and bad woman. And the good woman, bad woman here are very structural and not performative. So as you are born in a particular caste or in particular family that has parampara to gift their children to goddess or god is what determines your sexual purity. So that is the Nazariya, which sees housewife, like they actually use the term housewife, English term housewife. Housewife is seen in a very different way. Housewife. And then the woman who is dancing before many men, and which is Nazar. So Nazar is the male gaze that they are subjected to, and is what actually stigmatizes them in the society. So there are different perceptions on performance. So performance often is viewed through the lens of stigma, but at the same time also often it is a kind of self-respect assertion, because there is no blatant and obvious references to sexual connotations and sexual availability of these women. So therefore, certain times I'm a temple dancer, I'm dancing for Zagar and Gondhal. It is a kind of ritual which is must for caste Hindus when they get married, if a person, there is any auspicious occasion, and the village festivals, right? So performance has also labor is seen in the sacred terms, where like women see that they receive power from the god or goddess to dance all over the night. Okay, so 6 to 8 hours of overnight performances that women do. And the negation of male gaze, often some women also distinguish themselves by saying that, the men's nazar is on me, but my nazar is on God. So I'm actually performing for God, and therefore they evoke spirituality and dedication to the god or goddess in order to perform this before all male audience. So women's, perspectives on conjugality is very interesting and very fascinatingly different from what we assume. We means, again, this we is like critically we. So, middle classes and also sometimes Dalit middle classes also enter into a marriage which is patriarchal and caste endogamous often, but they do not have right to get married, but how do they view themselves? So in the traditional identities, they hold perspectives like, non-wife category is emerging out of the tradition, and age-old tradition that they cannot deny. They are not agential about. They aspire to break parampara, but there is no way, because, a woman was saying, like most of these women, Dhangar caste women who are dedicated in this tradition, who eventually sometimes enter into, semi-permanent relationships or, sexually available to other caste men, actually say that there is nothing wrong in being the second wife or, accessed by a man, because, maybe nothing wrong is what they evidently said, that the deity Khandoba, who was already married, sees Malsa, Banu, who is the lower caste Dhangar woman, falls in love and gets married to her or accesses her, and also kind of builds a house which is at the, which is at the entry to his first wife. So he has 2 wives, and then, if gods can have 2 wives, why can't a mortal man have 2 wives, is one of the perceptions that that women have. Marriage as also very desirable institute, particularly women from Telangana who are yoginis, who never call themselves as yoginis, they only call themselves as ex-yoginis. How much ever young they are, they may be 18 to 35, or 40 is maximum that I spoke to, that all of them actually say we are ex-yoginis, we are not yoginis, we walked out of the system. And they also, the status of married woman they evoke, but at the same time they have children, but they do not have a husband because they were not married in the way to the man. And they aspire marriage, they also glorify this system, but at the same time also find it very difficult to, break the barriers of the yogini system. And the tradition of, they're very emphatic about the origin of this tradition, which is actually not called yogini. Yogini is what the term assigned to them by the upper caste, but they call it as intikichkotam, is a kind of marriage which doesn't have a man, but which allows this woman to stay back in the natal family, and also the father's property will be bequeathed to her, and she can continue with the father's surname and beget children with the father's surname. But in the government records, for instance, in the schools, children don't get admitted, because how can your father's surname be your children's surname? And often people also, including me as an interlocutor, often stumbled by asking them who is the biological father, and none of them know who is the biological father. And they do not explicitly say anything about the sexual exploitation. They say, as I am yogini, where will be the father's identity for the children? So that is what, so one of the, since I said that, even I stumbled by asking them who is the father or the biological father of the child. So I would like to also reflect upon my ability to be the interlocutor to this community. So contradictions often arise between the language of the interlocutor and the research, as both use the term marriage. Are you married? Yes, I'm married. Who is your husband? No, I'm married. I'm married in a different way. Right? So therefore, every time a question like, are you married, is followed by, who is your husband? And what's his surname, or what is he doing? So therefore, they are very emphatic about their identity as married women, at the same time also married, but no man is there in their lives. And the limitations of language become evident as the hegemonic language not only defines the marginalized, but also serves as primary medium between the academics and the field. So therefore, the questions like, who is the biological father, or if you are married, who are you married to, who is your husband, are the questions that are part of my questionnaire that intervenes with the and as we see, language is composed of signs that shape meaning spectrum of the culture. So there are communities that in India, in the same society or in the same village society, who do not share the same language because they don't share the same cultural values or even the cultural systems. Okay, and the selective tradition, as Raymond Williams says, is governed by caste. Here it is governed by caste that is extensively interested and passionate about distinguishing women of their caste from the castes that are inferior. And so this tradition, if you ask, is it a caste Hindu tradition or a Dalit tradition, it is between these two caste people, because the people who sponsor this kind of a tradition is the caste Hindus, and the persons who have the parampara are the Dalits. So therefore, it is not that the caste Hindus want to do away with, but caste Hindus would also say that they have parampara, they have to do it, but at the same time, they are not like our women, they are sexually available, they are very different from the community of women that we have. So these are the some of the contextualization. But there is also, as I said, I have a husband, I have children, but I'm not supposed to get married. So this is what she is saying. Because I got married to the god Khandoba. No, I'm not supposed to get married. No, marriage is only with Khandoba. If I get married, the Samaj is society would consider it inauspicious and prevent me from doing such a thing. Samaj means anyone. It can be anyone, everyone. So in the sense,
Yes.
okay. Yeah. So I don't have much time, but I'll just finish with this one point that Shivashaktis and Jogapas, loosely you can say trans, but you also cannot translate these identities as simply trans women, because I'm not talking in the right-wing sense of this is a westernization and all, because that's a Western term, but these are very traditional temple-related identities where Shivashaktis and Jogapas started upholding the temple dedication, unlike Joginis and Murlis, as a means of assertion of their varied gender expression and the sexual orientation. So with that, I will stop, because anyway, I don't have time. Yeah, thank you.
Sowjanya.
I would like to actually answer your questions if you have any.
We are going to take the questions now, but because we are running short of time, we are going to only take one round of questions. Yeah, 15 minutes. 10 minutes, yes.
So I have a question for Professor Raj Kumar. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. It's in relation to the concept of world literature as envisioned by Goethe and Seller. So in which I just wanted to know in what ways can Dalit literature be actually contribute to or challenge the notions of world literature, and what could be the possible implications of integrating this this Dalit literature into the canon of world literature for the Eurocentric, construction of world literature. Thank you.
It's on, right? Hello. My question is to Professor Raj Kumar. He talked about idealization and romanticization in a lot of progressive writers. But I was wondering if it is not also possible to say, or is it that romanticism and idealization of different kinds, maybe of better kinds, are also found in Dalit literature, and what is the significance of that? Because after all, it can serve in a good purpose as well. Secondly, this is important, I think, because also because being a Dalit does not automatically ensure that one will be able to represent or do justice to Dalit experience. Secondly, I also found it interesting that you talked about how a Rashik, a lover of art in the Indian sense, Indological tradition, cannot, that way we cannot understand Dalit aesthetics. I agree, but I was wondering here that, I was thinking about an essay by Gopal Guru. It's called Food as Metaphor. Here, the way you say that a Rashik cannot appreciate Dalit aesthetics, Gopal Guru here says that sweetness in food was something associated with upper castes. And lower caste people often thought of sweet things as not necessarily healthy, but meat as more healthy and nutritious and stuff like that. There was an aesthetic, the different way of looking at it here. Kind of ideological politics, so you can say. So, but then he also says that this idea of sweetness was appropriated by...
Can we cut short a little bit?
Yeah,
because
it's
we
about
don't
to
have
come to
a
an
lot of
end.
time.
Was later appropriated by middle-class Dalit writers also. So I was wondering if you could talk about, struggle from inside Dalit, different castes.
So for that, too many questions. So I don't know, I have to be very brief because we have no time. Yes, world literature, that Delhi University has a, there is another question? Sorry?
From the back.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a paper called World Literature where Jhutan is being part of. You know that you are very right that we have to, you know that not only maybe, you know, the travel around the world, that is precisely because whenever there is any violation of human rights anywhere now, because you know that it is a globalized world, mobilization is possible very, you know that quickly to fight against inhuman rights, and Dalit rights are also human rights. So that is where, you know, that Dalit texts can be part of world literature. So I, you know, fully agree with you. Now the idealization of Dalit body, romanticization, Dalit experiences you talk about, you know, that all these are already being discussed in many fora. Yeah, these are not new things. If at all, you know, that I have to tell you about that, it depends on, you know, that being a Dalit, what are you writing? Because I don't think, you know, that Dalit writings can be understood as romanticization. In what sense? You know, you have to give me maybe example, maybe not in question answer session, we can have a dialogue, then only I'll be able to, you know, that maybe counter your question. Because what I stated, Dalit writing is based on lived life experiences. You can always question, of course, say someone is writing about, say, one's life, autobiography, then you can question the idea of memory. But I don't know where do we find romanticization and idealization is Dalit writing. So that I have, at least so far, I have no idea about. Now about food, sweetness, you know that the idea of, you know, that how food is being theorized according to Hindu philosophy, Rajasika, Tamasika, if you try to understand about. Food is sweet, not because, you know, that it is sweetened by sugar or good, yeah, because there are gunas. Gunas is, you know, the value inscribed in food. So that's why, you know, that Anjal was, while presenting, she was talking about how she has to find a place where only vegetarian food, no? Otherwise, you know, she talked, how nicely she talked about washing her hand, you know, how many times not to smell around so that, you know, that people will try it. So when we talk about sweetness of food, actually, you know, that Hindu philosophy talks about gunas. Gunas, you know, this is, you know, that it is not so, that's why non-vegetarian foods are being, you know, meaning it is not to be consumed because it arouses unnecessary sexual desire. Also, as you very rightly say, perhaps, you know, that you are trying to hint at that, say, non-vegetarian food like, say, beef, even though, you know, there are lots of protein and other thing, it is to be prohibited because you know, cow is holy, no? Dienja, you know, that holy cows is to be reminded, you know, that hereafter, and there is a lot of, you know, the discourse around. So this is not new. What I want to tell you is that once certain prescriptive laws are available, what to eat, what not to eat, what to speak, what not to speak, what to write, what not to write, what to wear, what not to wear. Meaning, Kalyan Rao in his Untouchable Spring talks very nicely that in, you know, that in India we have everything to be caste. No, the language will speak, the air we breathe, even gods have caste and demons have caste. So I think, you know, that this is now, you know, that the final thing I want to talk about is this is where, you know, that we are entering into the architecture of inequality. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Aarushi or Sowjanya?
I have a question.
Okay.
Can I ask?
Let's
Yeah.
go.
So my question is to Professor Sowjanya. So I wanted your take on how do we understand the contemporary, you know, setting, how caste and sexuality mediate in our contemporary setting. Specifically, keeping of cases like now the very viral, personality of this Mona Lisa that we saw, who got famous on the Kumbh, and there was an entire stream of social media who was behind her exotic features, and there was a conversation about how exotic she looks, and there were of course references to her being tribal and Dalit as well, and she comes out and she says that she belongs from the Pardi community. So that is one, and second is also like the very entire history of Bharatnatyam. So how would you, conceptualize that, specifically taking, conversations sparked by Nitya Pillai, who is a hereditary, comes from a hereditary dance performance family, performer families. So Nitya also talks about the role of, caste, and specifically in performance. So keeping all these very contemporary, conversations around us, and specifically your work that looks at performance, I was also wondering how do we engage with, specifically when you're presenting, a lot of your presentation is talking about how Dalit women or lower caste women of, different communities, they are engaging with, their identities in very, of course, different manner, where sexuality, like we always see it as subjugated, but your presentation also brings that agency in front, where sexuality is contested very differently. So in that sense, how do we really, connect the dots? So thank you, and I'm sorry this will also be the last question because we have Professor Robert joining us shortly online. So thank you.
Yeah. So the question about Mona Lisa. Right? Yeah. So, see, I am actually thinking on the lines of, on the one hand, there is a, as I said, Gopal Guru theorizes the Dalit body as walking carrion. At the same time, also there is desirability, and this desirability has certain limitations as well. And the limitation of this desirability is that the desire is very dehumanized, because in reality, it is not the woman from the lower caste, are not becoming the wife or, life partner or friend or anything, right? So as intermarrying and interdining is prohibited, so there is a dehumanization of that desire, of the woman in that desirability, because this woman then becomes simply a body, and that is available in a particular context with the limited periods of time, and shaped by caste. So therefore, you also see Mona Lisa as like, available and, exotic, but what is the limitation of it is that, she is going to be casted in the film or something like that, okay? So that is one aspect of the sexuality caste, and, particularly with regard to Dalit women. And the second question you asked, is the dance, the performance. See, there is a whole lot of history, which is also very well researched, is that the dance art form, say tamasha, is stigmatized. And what Murlis performed during Zagaran Gondhal is actually also, stigmatized. And there are also modern art forms, like, say, women who, they are not forms as such, but there are arts, like where bar dancers perform and the record dancers perform. So these performances are stigmatized. But there are two things in the history of upper casteization or the Brahminization of the dance happened. One is the more erotic gestures, the strong erotic gestures have been done away with when the Brahmins inherited the dance like Bharatanatyam. And second is, since the Brahmins are performing, the Nataraja came into the picture. What is actually Nataraja? Nataraja, Hinduism might not have necessarily any connection to that dance, except that the Devdasis who are part of temple structures, structures in a different way, not are dancing. But Nataraja is actually symbolizes the defeat of Parvati, the woman who actually holds art and dance as her, her property. And Nataraja, if you actually see, Nataraja is symbolized by a gesture, posture, where he is actually showing his private parts. So he defeats Parvati Parvati or Shakti in a duel where he is dancing, she is also dancing, and he actually removes his clothes and shows the posture in which he is showing his private parts. And then the Shakti says, how can I do this? And she accepts the defeat. That's where the idea of women's body and concealment and reticences on language, all those are symbolized by that one act. So the more it is Brahminized, in the sense religious basis was brought into that performance, that when you actually learn, so many South Indian children, when they go to learn Bharatanatyam, the first thing is to do puja. Okay, so it's like art, in how John Burgess looks at art, European art, which is also very much connected to the religiosity, church, and most of the pictures have either Jesus or a figure which is, that is really ambiguous, whether we don't know whether it is Jesus or something else. So similar to that, they have mystified the art. And when you mystify and also Brahminize, then it became the one of the classical arts. So that is the history of dance and performance. Yeah.
Thank you. We are closing the session. Thank you. I thank all my speakers. That was a great session. Thank you.
How long will it take? 5 minutes. Okay, so let's start.
Long day for me, because early morning.